you're ready, you can start the recording. Perfect. All right. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this first webinar of the IDN European Circle. Topic of the night is rights of nature, and I think we've managed to find three interesting speakers, three interesting people that will tell us something more about what rights of nature is or are, and what their work around it is. I'll shortly introduce each of the speakers, and then we'll just head into it and give the floor to the interesting folks. So first up is Neil Williams. He's an interdisciplinary philosopher specializing in environmental, moral, and political philosophy and the history of philosophy. So lots of philosophical knowledge there. And one of his current projects is around interdisciplinary investigations into the rights of nature. Neil is also the editor of the journal Public Humanities, and he participates in public engagement whenever possible. Then we have Thomas Rickard, who studied participatory water governance in Brazil, and he's currently a researcher, writer, and activist for nature-centric governance in the UK. He's also the interim coordinator of the UK Rights of Nature Network, and he also represents nature on the board of We Are Nature Based, which is a community interest company. I think that's a specific company form of the UK. And locally, he's on the steering group of the Friends of the River X, and interested in bioregioning South Devon. So yeah, lots of practical knowledge there, and if I understood correctly before, Thomas will take us along on a very interesting ride. And then we're finishing with Tish, who's more on the practical side, or she's going to tell us more about the practical side of rights of nature. Tish is a consulting director at the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, and she's been involved in community rights and rights of nature since 2012. And in that time, she's worked with dozens of communities on anti-fracking, anti-pipeline, right to a livable climate, fair and free elections, water privatization issues. So a very broad range of which rights of nature is also a part. And then in 2019, she helped pass a historic Bill of Rights, the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, and currently she's working together with residents and a state legislator in New York on moving the Great Lakes Bill of Rights forward. She's also lectured and taught plenty of workshops on rights of nature, as we're having tonight. And she's been CELDF Democracy School instructor. So with that being said, I think I'll give the floor to Neil. So Neil, go ahead if you want to share your screen.
Yeah, let's give it a go. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see the start of the slideshow.
Yep.
Great, cool. Well, I'll give myself 15 minutes because I want to make sure we have enough time for conversation. It's great to be here. Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to learning more about degrowth. So I'm really interested about how rights of nature and degrowth relate to each other. I know very little about degrowth. So I'll say a little bit about rights of nature. I am a philosopher, not a lawyer. So if you want some legal, like some more legal background on the rights of nature, you'll have to go elsewhere. But I am very interested in the moral background behind the rights of nature. And I think the rights of nature is primarily a moral movement. It's a way of reevaluating our relationships with nature, and that gets expressed in a legal frame. But really, a lot of the moral stuff is doing the work, I think. So I'll say a little bit about that, and then I'll speculate wildly at the end of the talk about what the connections might be with degrowth, and you can tell me whether or not I'm right. Okay, so for those of you who haven't heard about rights of nature before, here's a very brief overview. I've got this thing in my way. Let me see if I can move it. Good. Cool. Rights of Nature is an environmental movement. It's a new approach to legislation, activism, environmental law, and conservation, in which rather than seeing nature as an object that needs to be preserved, protected, or managed, or properly distributed among the community, it is treated as a legal subject, something deserving of rights, something that deserves to be taken seriously, and which interests need to be taken seriously for their own right. There's different ways of doing this, lots of different ways. I mean, the ways that rights of nature gets expressed in different legal and cultural contexts is really diverse. But in general, some of the ways in which this happens is that rights are granted to nature as a whole. This has happened in the Ecuadorian constitution, for instance, or specific ecosystems, so specific rivers, mountains, and forests are granted legal personality and all of the corresponding rights that go along with legal personhood. So there are prominent cases. I'll show a map in just a second. But this is spreading across the world. I think it's active in something like 39 different countries. Here's a smattering of these cases. So I'm not going to be able to talk about any of these in any detail. The first real prominent case was the Ecuadorian constitution, where, as I said before, nature was given rights in the Ecuadorian constitution. It was followed by a similar law in Bolivia, cases in New Zealand, and then this is popping up all over the place. Here in Europe, we have a case in the Mar Menor Lagoon. Thomas might say a little bit more about what's going on in the UK. Both he and I are involved in the UK Rights of Rivers movement. But honestly, this is, wherever you look, this is happening. So it's really exciting stuff. Back in 2021, there were 178 legal provisions across 27 countries. Like I said, now I think it's closer to just below 40. Here's a really useful resource for anyone who really wants up-to-date information about rights of nature. The Eco Jurisprudence Monitor keeps tabs on all of the cases, or at least the cases that they are informed of. And I think last time I checked, there were something like 523 cases across all of these different countries. So it's the fastest growing legal movement in the world, at least I've heard it said that that's the case. But like I said, I don't think we need to primarily think about it as a legal movement. I think it is also a moral movement. It's a way of reevaluating and reframing our relationship with nature. So with this in mind, I tend to present rights of nature as being made up of two pillars. The first one is about value. It's about seeing nature as intrinsically valuable. That is, valuable for its own sake, not as a resource, not as an object for our use, as a subject of rights, not as an object. So when I say intrinsic value, this is all I really mean. When we value something intrinsically, we value it for its own sake. We value it as important or significant for its own right, not for something else that it might give us. And then the other really important feature that we need to focus on when we're talking about rights of nature is the empowerment of Indigenous groups and local communities who are best placed to speak for the interests and rights of nature. So if we have both of these things, like I said, rights of nature takes a very diverse forms across the world. But I think if we have both of these present, then what we're looking at is the rights of nature. And if one of these things is absent, then it isn't really the rights of nature. So value, recognizing the intrinsic value of nature, and the importance of representation from Indigenous groups or local communities, those who are living with and are in concrete relationships with nature. So here's just some quotes from various legislation and activists in the area, proving my point. So Kirsty Luke is a member of the Tuhoi Iwi, part of the negotiating team for getting Te Urewera rights back in, I believe, 2014. And here's a really powerful statement of how we think about the value of nature. Te Urewera is not property. Te Urewera is not real estate. Te Urewera is my mother. So Kirsty Luke here is emphasizing, along with, this is a part of Maori cosmology, but it's a part of a lot of different indigenous worldviews, the idea that relationships with nature are kin relationships. So that's not a relationship of property, it's not a relationship of primarily of use, it's a relationship, a familial relationship, a relationship of kin in which we intrinsically value the nature that we're talking about. This is also written into various rights of nature documents. Here's a case from the Ecuadorian constitution. Nature has the right to integral respect for its existence and maintenance and regeneration of its lifestyle cycles. So the idea here is that nature has value. It should be respected for its own sake, not just for what it might provide us, not for the uses it provides us with. So that's the first pillar, the value pillar, seeing nature as intrinsically valuable. But we also have this other side, the representation pillar. So usually when we're talking about the rights of nature, we see that local communities, indigenous peoples are empowered to speak on behalf of nature. Again, this takes many different forms across the world where rights of nature finds its place. Often we see new guardianship institutions are created to represent nature, new bodies that are specifically designed to allow people to speak on behalf of nature. For instance, in New Zealand, we see these new institutional bodies made up by local Maori iwi and also representatives from the Crown. Similar situations are happening in Manor and other places across the world. In places like Ecuador, it's the case that any citizen in principle could bring action in the name of nature, but in practice, it's really those local communities that are speaking on and acting for on behalf of their ecosystems. Hopefully, Thomas will say a little bit more in a second about representation and how we might think about representing non-human nature. And we can find both aspects articulated here in the Constitutional Court Judgment of Columbia. Here we see that rights of nature is given because with recognition that human beings are just one species, they don't have priority, they don't have prevalence, they don't have particular importance, then in no way should be seen as the owner of other species or should be treating nature as property. And as a result, nature is seen as a true subject of rights, and this must be recognized by states, exercised under the tutelage of their legal representatives, for example, by the communities that inhabit it or have a special relationship with it. So here we see the intrinsic value of nature being recognized and the fact that it's those who already have a special relationship with nature that are best placed to act as representatives for those rights. So, two aspects then that are worth paying attention to. One, that we recognize nature as having intrinsic value, independently of the use it might have for human beings. And two, that we should empower indigenous groups and local communities to be guardians and best placed to represent those rights. So the important thing to note here then is rights of nature is not just about nature, and it's not just about empowering human communities, it's about the relationship between these two things. And this shouldn't come as too much of a surprise to us, because I would like to suggest that rights are in fact relationships. Rights always describe relationships within a moral and legal community. So to have a right is just for one person or one entity or one group to have a legitimate claim to expect a certain kind of treatment from another person or entity who therefore has a duty. So rights describe this relationship. Rights just mean that one person has a claim and another person has a duty or a responsibility to respect that claim. And so by mapping out these rights, what we're doing is we're helping mapping out what the boundaries of our moral and legal community are. So this is what we do when we talk about human rights. My right to life is very much your duty to respect my right to life, right? So these two things go hand in hand. You cannot have rights without responsibility. And so this is what it looks like when we grant or recognize nature's rights. If a river has a right, it means that it has a legitimate claim not to be polluted, and that places us as the community that lives within that river, or as citizens of a country in which that river has been given rights, to respect. We have a duty to respect the river's right to not be polluted. So really what we're doing, I think, when we're recognizing nature's rights in this way, is that we are recognizing that nature is part of our moral and legal community. So nature no longer becomes a resource to distribute among our moral and legal community. We're no longer talking about what a fair distribution of land is, for instance. We're talking instead that nature has a seat at the table. It's included in our moral and legal community, and we might owe responsibilities and duties directly to nature. So that's my very quick summary of what rights of nature means, I think, in terms at least of philosophy, morality, and representation, my focus on value and representation. So I think rights of nature combines this recognition that nature has intrinsic value with a recognition that people who live in concrete relationships of care are best placed to represent nature. So it embodies the idea that empowering local communities and making sure that local communities are healthy goes hand in hand with empowering nature and making sure that nature is healthy. And rights of nature rethinks our relationship with the natural world because it enables us to see nature as part of our moral and legal community rather than a resource to distribute around it. So the last 3 minutes, I'm just going to say a couple of things about how this might connect to degrowth. And again, this is wildly speculative, so you feel free to tell me, or I'm interested in learning more about what you think, what the connections are between rights of nature and degrowth. So I was asked to say something about how rights of nature might lead us to a more equitable and sustainable world. I think it definitely can, or it is one of the tools that we have available to us to lead us to a more equitable and sustainable world. As I've said, rights of nature sees that social justice and ecological justice are necessarily connected. You can't have one without the other. You can't have nature's rights without empowering local communities and indigenous peoples to speak for those rights. When implemented, I think rights of nature gives both local communities and non-human nature collectively a seat at the table in decision making. So any decisions that will affect those local communities or will affect nature. So that's the equitable side of things. I think it moves us towards a more socially just and ecologically just situation. I think it is also leads us to a more sustainable world, not least because if nature is included in the decision making, if a river is included in the decision making about how to manage that river, it's likely that there's going to be more sustainable decisions made for how to maintain, improve, restore that river. I'm somewhat concerned by the language of sustainability, but another thing to say here might be that rights of nature pushes us towards a more deep understanding of sustainable. So rather than thinking about sustainability as what is good for human beings in the long term, it encourages us to think not just about human interests, but also about non-human animals and ecosystems and what is sustainable for their interests in the long term. So rights of nature may well lead us to a more equitable and sustainable world. Finally, some synergies that might be seen with the degrowth movement. One, I think that rights place limits on economic activity. We see this in human rights. It doesn't prevent us from employing people, for instance, but it does put quite strict, human rights put quite strict limits on how we employ people, what counts as fair employment, and how we demarcate exploitative treatment. And the same can be said for rights of nature. It doesn't prevent us from using nature as a resource, rather it places limits on what counts as reasonable or non-exploitative use of nature. And in virtue of seeing nature not as mere property and mere resource, but as something that has intrinsic value and something that is a subject in its own right, it also implicitly critiques purely economic measurement of land, ecosystem, and nature, which I understand degrowth movement does also. It prioritizes social and ecological flourishing rather than economic growth. It seeks empowerment of local groups indigenous peoples, and so therefore moving away from the idea that the best way of managing the environment is through state or corporate management, but rather returning to place-based local understandings. It seeks social rather than technological solutions to environmental issues. Rights of nature is perhaps a social solution to environmental issues. It says that what we need to do is reevaluate our relationships with nature rather than come up with some quick technological fix. Focuses on the autonomy both of local groups, but also of nature itself by enabling it to have a say in decision making. And this is a longer conversation, but one I'd be willing to have in discussion if you're interested. It recognizes, I think, the connection between different systems of domination. The ways that we dominate the environment and the ways that we dominate other people are connected. And so you can't remove one kind of domination without removing another. Okay, so that is slightly over 15 minutes, but I'll stop there. Here are my contact details if you're interested in chatting about it more, but I look forward to the conversation and seeing what there is to say about rights of nature and degrowth. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, right. Thanks a lot, Neil. That was super clear, I think. Yeah, I think we'll just immediately hand it over to Thomas. Go ahead.
Great. Thanks very much, Neil. Lovely overview. So I want to jump into a slightly different kind of presentation, a bit of a story to start with. So here in the southwest of England, in Devon, we have the River Exe. And last year in September, some of us gathered in a customs house where they used to collect taxes on things coming up the river. It's a beautiful old customs house, 300 years old, lovely plaster ceilings filled with animals. And on this special day, these animals looking down from the ceiling, they saw something very different. Animals gathered around, seated on the floor, sprawled, perched, sat, rooted, a frog with mottled black eyes, a kingfisher with flowing coloured wings, blue mussel and Pacific oyster with their great rippling shells, meadow sweet with soft flowers. And two women stood up. One is water and one is river. And they said, "We have gathered here to listen to our kin, the species of the River Exe. We're going to hold this space openly, hearing from each being. Perhaps we can weave a story of our shared beingness and kinship. Perhaps we can create a covenant, an agreement that holds our samenesses and differences equally in mind so that others might hear our story." So my job on that day was to capture some of the squawks, murmurs, thumps, and human language of this gathering. We asked them, what brings you harm? What deprives you of what you need to thrive? What brings you flourishing, allowing you to live a healthy life? Tell us your stories. So Heron, with her great grey wings, says that she is flourishing, but she suffers to see the suffering of the other species around her. Sphagnum moss, in a great crested green mask, is doing okay, but sees more dry spells and is concerned about the future. Beaver, great brown beaver, is making a comeback, but asks for human trust to shape the landscape according to its wisdom. And salmon with a long hooked beak reminds us of their gift to so many generations of human beings. And there's so few of them left now struggling over the dams. There was also a human as river being, cloaked in blue with great reeds behind her, and she expressed a very deep regret at the harm humans had imposed upon the other beings of the river. And in hearing that, Daphnia, a tiny water flea, said that her bitterness and her judgment towards humans had softened. We all shared a little moment of grief and connection. So all of those river beings have unique stories, but they held the river in common. They told us about habitat destruction and their care for others, water temperatures rising, fear and hope for the future. They told us that untreated sewage is not just polluting water, it's an offense to the sacred and living river. So we took down those expressions of harm and flourishing on a great scroll sprawled across the floor, and we made our marks. The humans made their marks, the river beings made their marks, a covenant we made, a promise to become guardians of the River X in our own ways, however large, however small, sometimes alone, sometimes together, a promise to remember the call of the beings present on that day, our responsibilities, our relationships, our river. So now it's your turn. So I have an invitation for you all to remember a river. Is there a river close to you now? Is there one from your home, from your childhood, one you played with or in or you walk by? What do you see in that memory? What's happening around you? Is the day bright or overcast? Are there trees or buildings? What do you feel next to the river? And now I want you to, if you're happy to, close your eyes and just notice your breath. Notice the weight of your body, which is the weight of water. Our ancestors came from the sea. We carry the salt of the sea in our blood. We become life in the sea of the womb. Every cell of us is water, itself teeming with life. This river you remember, imagine yourself now as this river. Your head and fingers and arms are tributaries, and the water flows down through you, building in depth, in speed, gathering in. You can feel deep soil that the water runs over and through. You are the water. You are the dappled sunlight cast across your ripples on your surface. You can feel the fish that swim inside you. You can feel the shade of the trees and vegetation by your side. And out beneath you, you can feel the pulsing tide of the sea caressing you in this beautiful exchange of life. So here we are as rivers. But now I ask you, as a river, what do you want? What do you need? What is it that comes to you? What are you called to say? And of course, today, unfortunately, we don't have time to hear from all of you, from every river in this gathering here today. But as you come to open your eyes, as you come back to the room here, and just hold that sense of being a river with you for a moment. I was asked this question as part of an interspecies council, a represented river on a council, where we responded to a DEFRA land use consultation. So that's UK land use policy. They asked people, what should we do? And we gathered as humans and more than humans to think about that. I became a river and I became very angry And I said something like this, go shit somewhere else. This is what I want to tell the government. Take this beautiful filtered river water. What are you doing with it? Why are you washing your shit with it? Give that to soil. Give it to the other creatures who would want it. Get out the way. Pull out the weirs. Pull out the dams. Back off from my banks. However productive your fields are, they're nothing without the life that surrounds them. Make human representation strong in your trust, in your catchment partnerships, in every body of people that touches my tributaries, which is all of them. Stand up for me and my brethren life. Listen, or I will flood your homes and burn your crops. And it doesn't matter how I feel, this is a consequence that I don't want any of us to bear. So there were many other contributions that day from different species, and I'll post a link to more about that particular event. But the reason I'm sharing these experiences here on this webinar is because I think for a lot of us, the idea of becoming a river or becoming a heron or becoming a frog is a strange idea, unless you're a child, which is very natural. But as grown-ups, and especially in a formal decision-making space, it's not within the bounds of mainstream work. It's also actually, I think, quite easy, and in my experience, very easy for people to drop into a kind of empathetic or a different perspective. It's a natural ability, I think. Now, of course, that doesn't mean what we say, we should ask questions as to, whether what we say is right or not. What is the validity of our intuition and what is our empathy? But one of the barriers, I think, to rights of nature is not only laws and protocols and structures and ideas and in economics and ethics, but it's just the experience of doing it. It's just how do we sit together and actually bring nature or a river or a species into the room? Not in a way of, in the way that sciences might, even though we need, ecologists, not just in the way that lawyers might when they bring up environmental laws and protections, but in this kind of more intuitive, empathetic sense where we use imagination, where we use play, where we take on a different perspective. I think that's the power of rights of nature. Now, of course, we don't have Indigenous peoples in the UK here to support us or to guide us as they might have in New Zealand or Ecuador or some other cases. We do have some people trying to gather in wisdom, Indigenous wisdom, as well as lots of other forms of wisdom to help us. And I'll post some links to that. But my attitude is here in the UK, we just need to get on with experimenting and kind of fall on our face and keep trying. And I'm very excited to see a small but very rapidly expanding movement here. We've had 3 district councils pass river rights motions. We've had Southampton City Council. We have 3 catchment partnerships, river basin management bodies with nature guardians. Yeah, that's the frame, is that they're going to speak for and as the river. Yeah, and that's apart from Nature on the Board and other initiatives here in the UK. What's the link to degrowth? Well, I really appreciate Neil citing all of those links to degrowth, because my suggestion, is related to what I've just been talking about. Is one of the challenges to degrowth the familiarity or comfort that people feel with the idea, with the proposition? Is it the lack of experience people have in taking part in participatory democracy, in taking part in economies that aren't oriented to growth, extraction, and never-ending profit? And I wonder about how to provide more of these experiences and more opportunities without getting stuck in debates about the very particular kind of mechanisms and proposals and structures. How do we just play, jump into it and play to get things moving? Because we're in a kind of such an urgent situation that we need to slow down and mess about. Okay, so that's my presentation. And thanks very much for listening to it. And I wish I could hear much more from you about what your rivers wanted or needed. And perhaps we'll get a moment for that. But for now, I shall pass back to Jen.
Wow. Thanks a lot, Thomas. That was, yeah, at least from my end, truly amazing. Yeah, thanks for the experience and like broadening the webinar in a very nice way. I think, yeah, I'll hand it over to Tish to wrap it up.
Thank you. And thank you both, Tom and Neil. Those were really great. It makes me happy to like know that there's other people across the pond, as they say, right? That are also talking like we do here on this side, and sharing a lot of the same, convictions and values. But thank you for inviting me today. About rights of nature, to talk about rights of nature and our work at CELDF. And I went to your website too, the Degrowth website, to read more about your work. And once I did, I thought, well, I can see there's a lot of alignment and agreement in our values and vision for the future, like you guys have already talked about. And I'd say it's, I'm someone who's gone out and worked on the ground with grassroots communities, trying to implement rights of nature. And it's probably the topic most avoided in all the community meetings, government meetings, and hearings that I've attended over the years, that, they get focused on talking about switching energy sources from fossil fuels to solar, or, that we should require big industrial agriculture to install sewage filtration systems so that the shit doesn't go into the rivers, or that we should use paper bags over plastic bags. And the one thing that, is never talked about, though, is reducing what we consume, using less. And I think, of course, that aligns with your degrowth message. If you want to, since I can't share my screen, Chime, if you want to put up slide 1 there, that would be great. So who and what is CELDF? We're a nonprofit public interest law firm, and we started 30 years ago in 1995. So this is exactly our 30th year. And the fact that we've lasted this long surprises many people, especially many of us on staff. I think one of the reasons, though, we have lasted so long, even though we're very small and have managed to accomplish a lot, I think, with very little, is because not only are we passionate, but we have continuously evolved and continued to learn from everyone who we've worked with, and especially the people in those communities over the last 30 years. So we've learned as much from them as I think they've learned from us. And because, to be honest, I mean, we can all talk about and write about, what should be and have interesting conversations, but actually trying to implement these ideas and strategies, is a necessary part of the process. And I would say it's the really hard part. It's the most difficult part. And so, it makes sense that a lot of people, probably don't want to go there or try it. If you could switch to the next slide. Since we achieved like this 30-year milestone this year, we've done a lot of reflecting. COVID obviously forced a lot of us to do a lot of reflecting with the shutdowns, but I think, Tom, you mentioned it too, and this is really important, that this is going to involve, we're talking about a movement and a big shift in culture. So it's like, this is going to involve a lot of experimentation, and the realization that creative ideas need to be tried and implemented, and that sometimes you're even going along, you have to be willing to abandon some of these great ideas you had when you're like, this isn't working. And I think that's hard for many big organizations and institutions to do, and reinforces, I guess, maybe why being smaller is an advantage. Again, another cultural thing, growth in size isn't everything, even though our culture teaches us that it is. So back to phase 1, like I said, we've divided our work kind of into these 3 phases. And in 1995, when we started and opened the doors, that was just doing environmental protection like everyone else. So we thought, we'll use these great environmental laws that we have on the books, we'll hire a good lawyer, fight the permit, and we'll win. I mean, that's what we were taught to do. So we thought that the problem was that communities didn't have enough access to affordable legal representation at that time. And we would win on paper. And despite that, though, the corporate applicants always in the end won, because we figured out they wrote the rules. They were written by them for their benefit. And so, that idea that the house always wins. So after a while, it's like, well, why are we still doing this? I mean, this is ridiculous. So the next phase of reflection, and I would say phase 2, began around probably 2006. And that's when our efforts and strategy shifted to changing the rules instead of trying to play by them. The idea that the system isn't broken, but that it's fixed. And that shifts how you think your activism works. So we began working on ways to shift the laws to benefit both the human and other than human members of the communities with these local bills of rights that included rights of nature. If you want to switch to the next slide. CELDF drafted the very first law in the capitalist colonial legal system. I don't say Western anymore because Eastern has gotten really good at this too, with the capitalist system. But and it was a really brave and courageous community in rural Southeast Pennsylvania called Tamaqua Borough that passed the law that we drafted. And to be clear, this wasn't a new idea. Okay, indigenous culture, as you've already heard, always understood the connection between humans and nature. And other academics, like Christopher Stone, who wrote Should Trees Have Standing in 1972, all created a foundation for us to build upon. And I think that's another important part of when we're talking about movements, right? That movements do rely on those who came before them. Next slide, please. And then 2 years after Tamaqua, which Tamaqua didn't get any attention at all. It was the first in the world, and it really, nobody paid much attention. But after that, 2 years later, it took that long, CELDF was called in to help draft that rights of nature language for the constitutional rewrite in Ecuador that you've heard about from Tom. Oh, no, Neil, I think, said that. But, and we thought at that time, oh my God, this is great. Like thousands of other communities are going to rush to join this movement. To be fair, I mean, there are hundreds, not thousands, but, and in the United States, that map that the Eco Jurisprudence Monitor, you can see I think has like 171 on there. So a lot in the United States did dive into this, but despite the hundreds of CELDF drafted communities and rights of nature laws that were being adopted, there was never the upswell to transform state and federal laws to validate the community and nature's rights. And of course, looking back, we were probably a bit naive at the time. I mean, the US is the belly of the beast of capitalism. And so we may have been overly optimistic at the time. Next slide, please. What did happen, though, was we got increased corporate litigation, attempts to disbar and sanction CELDF attorneys, punish communities with the threats of fines and bankruptcy. There was also the adoption of more restrictive state laws against community empowerment and the muzzling of free speech by making citizen initiatives more difficult to run and pass in local elections. But on the upside, we did see an acceleration of rights of nature in the movement globally. But, all these things that happened where the system came back crushing, which again, like it makes sense. They're just not going to let this happen because the people benefiting from capitalism are not going to just say, oh yeah, silly us, let's change this. So, it made sense that they were fighting back. Next slide, please. And that brings us to phase 3, where we are now. Again, COVID, like I said, forced us to all lock down, reflect. But our shift back, a few years ago it was accelerated when an LA-based activist artist named Andrea Bowers contacted CELDF about collaborating on an art exhibit about our rights of nature legal work. And at the time, to be honest, I mean, we were so engrossed in the legal world that at first we weren't sure about this, but we did have a conversation with her, and the conversations with her really forced us to think more about the cultural shift that had to happen. And I think we, looking back at phases 1 and 2, thought that law and policy changes would shift the culture. so we were forced to step back, and working with Andrea made us see that maybe the cultural shift in public's minds and their connection to nature needed to happen first in order to shift the laws. You know, I always ask this question now, and I kind of go talk to groups and I go like, does law shift culture or does culture shift the laws? And it really gets them, they start thinking about that and they're like, of course it's both, right? But it gets people to think about it, I think. You know, and when we think about it, our legal system, many of our religions, our economic systems, and our government systems are all based on separating us from nature. You know, so as long as we other nature and don't understand that we are nature, you know, or we don't have that deep love of place that we call home, that connection that both Neil and Tom talked about, you know, why would we fight to protect that place? And in a way, we've also reflected rights of nature is part of that othering, you know, but so that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but, you know, because we have corporate rights, we have human rights, we have nature's rights, right? So it still is putting up divides. But if it's a way to get us to where we need to go, then, you know, I think that's okay. Art forced us to think about some hard truths about the system and our work, and we had to reckon with some of those truths. And we're currently working on getting in right relationship with both our communities and our strategies moving forward. And I thought right here I would just share a few slides with Andrea's artwork so you can see what she did with our legal words and how she made them so, I guess, pop and so beautiful. So the one on the left, the Great Lakes, that's actually currently from language from the bill that's introduced into the New York legislature. And then the one on the right, the Lake Erie one, that's actually taken right from the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, and it's on the back of the Science Center in Cleveland, Ohio, which faces Lake Erie. Just so that like when people come and see these and like, look, it's like they're exposed to the idea of rights of nature, which maybe they've never heard of before. Next slide. This is just a piece because I didn't understand. I was so naive. I'm like, how are you going to make like our legal, you know, laws beautiful? And she did. And so this is just another piece. She took the Great Lakes Bill of Rights and did that. And then the last slide, next slide, please. She also made a documentary, and it's on our YouTube, the trailer. If you're interested, you can contact me. We can get you the full version, but it's tying industrial agriculture to the algae problem in the Great Lakes to rights of nature. And so it's what we do to nature, we do to ourselves is the name of the film. So anyway, this new phase that we're in now at CELDF, we're calling it community resistance and resilience. And we're focusing on building out expanded capacity and capability, providing community level resistance and resilience assistance that goes beyond lawmaking. Next slide, please. Communities need to address threats in real time, and maybe they can't wait 1 or 2 years or maybe a decade to see what happens in the courts or with regulatory agencies. And since the local authorities to protect human rights and ecological viability is denied most times to affected communities, and maybe over there in Europe, you know, you guys haven't got to where we are, right? Like once you guys get more of these passed, you might face more pressure and pushback, right? Because again, from these industries and capitalist systems that want to extract for their profits, that's when, you know, they're they're going to push back based on our experience. But so tactics like protest and direct action will probably be needed in some cases. And yet most communities don't know the first thing about these tactics because it's not something that we're taught. Right, we're taught to go to the hearings, but we're not taught to do any kind of other actions. Next slide. The resilience piece will mean building stronger mutual aid capabilities and the implementation of citizen assemblies, maybe alternative media systems, local food production, alternative economic systems, and energy sourcing. You know, all ways that a community can be self-reliant, you know, resilient. And we see this happening through the coordination with others, so building networks of expertise partner networks, in other words. It's almost an inside and outside approach with more emphasis on what communities need to be doing outside of the system, which again will entail a shift in cultural thinking about our connection to the natural world we're part of. You know, we're going to have this shift not only about our connection to nature, but that our dependence on government and corporations, right? How do we locally become collectively more independent? You know, just some of these examples, and it doesn't, you know, this idea too, we have to shift in our mind, what's a win, right? As in our culture, we think of a win as something that's taught to us, like it wins at the ballot box or something. But like in the example of the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, it was passed by the people, it got a lot of attention, but then the courts overturned it. You know, so some people go, that was a loss, but it really wasn't, because what it did do is it exposed and educated thousands of additional people to the idea of rights of nature. And so that is a win. I mean, it not only led to the art exhibit on rights of nature, but to a New York legislator contacting us even after it got overturned, and saying he wanted us to help him draft a bill to introduce into the state legislature. And when I said to him, I go, well, you do know that the Lake Erie Bill of Rights got overturned, don't you? And he said, yeah, I know that, but that's why we have to do this. You know, that it's really important that we do this, because it had made an impact on him. He got the connection. All our drinking water comes from the Great Lakes. I mean, so much of, we are the Great Lakes. It's running through our blood, as you mentioned, Tom. You know, it's like, that is who we are. And that was a first. So this New York legislator was brave. It took courage to do that. He's still looking for co-sponsors. But we had another state, North Carolina, introduce a rights of nature bill. And we're working with New Jersey folks and hoping that they might be the next state. So my point being that, you know, a real movement for change takes a lot of education, a lot of experimentation. And in the end, I believe also getting communities to see that the current system built on capitalism and continuous growth will never allow for nature to be recognized as rights-bearing and allow the humans living within these ecosystems to be the decision makers. But again, this explosion of rights of nature all over the globe, you know, which again, no time here to talk about, but also happy to talk with people who have interest another time. But I think, you know, we're in a place where it's becoming more and more obvious to more people that this current system of viewing people as consumers is not working. We were first subjects, and I think maybe over in Europe, you guys have more of that because you still have monarchs there, right? That this idea of being subjects to a system. Here in the US, we definitely built this system on seeing the people as being consumers. And I think we do have to move more to a story of where we see ourselves as citizens, and part of the ecosystems that we live in. They've been really good, the powers that be, at breaking us apart, breaking apart community by isolating us with technology, and they would love to do that even more, I think. Keeping us exhausted from working more than we should just to pay for basic necessities. They've done it with labeling us, dividing us with partisan politics, and of course, fear. And so we need to find creative ways to bring community in the places where we actually live back together. And that's why I really appreciated your exercise there, Tom, about making us, you know, feel like we are a river. I mean, everything we do as humans impacts nature, everything, just as everything that occurs in nature impacts us. We are nature, and the sooner we realize that and start acting with that understanding, I think the better for all life. And, you know, I think if we could get to that understanding as a societal norm, I don't even think that's when we wouldn't need rights of nature laws, because why would we need laws to tell us to not poison ourselves and destroy ourselves? That said, rights of nature laws and art exhibits and direct actions and academic research and conversations like this all have an important role to play in moving us towards that end goal. Last slide, and then I'm done. I see our work of being about all of us, bridging, blocking, and building. The bridging is important to develop those relationships that were mentioned with both the human and non-human life in our community. blocking may be necessary for that real-time threat that's happening that needs to be stopped now. And building is creating that alternative system and community we envision for the future. So I guess when we see ourselves as citizens of the place-based communities and ecosystems we live in, not virtually, but in the real world, and that, like we've also heard, that we have responsibilities and obligations to that place, then I believe we'll create the right laws and policies to ensure the health and continuation of life in that place. Oh, and I lied. So I think there's one more slide. Oh no, this is a slide. Yeah, that was it. Sorry. That's how you can contact CELDF. If you're interested, we're on all these things: YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. So thank you.